Today, we're heading over to Sokoto State in Nigeria.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. It is. We're going to be looking at, well, freedom of speech, actually.
Freedom of speech, huh?
Yeah,
Always a hot topic.
it really is. And this is a particularly troubling story. We're basing this deep dive on a recent article from Sahara Reporters. It's about a woman named Hamdia Sidi. She was arrested and secretly put on trial.
Secret trial. Okay, now I'm really interested.
Yeah, the reason behind her arrest, let's just say it's pretty unsettling. Basically, Hamdia, she's a resident of the Sokoto, posted a video online. In it, she's, expressing concern about the lack of security in the state.
Lack of security, what does that mean exactly?
Well, Sokoto is one of many states in northern Nigeria dealing with serious issues with banditry,
Ah, banditry. So we're talking...
armed groups.
Right.
Yeah, they're raiding villages, they're killing residents, looting, burning everything in their path. I mean, it's a terrifying situation for the people who live there.
And this is something that's been going on for a while.
Oh, yeah. Just last week, 4 farmers were killed in the Isa local government area of Sokoto. So it's not like, Hamdia's concerns were coming out of nowhere. It's a real problem.
Absolutely. A real and present danger.
Exactly. But instead of addressing this banditry problem, the government decided to arrest Hamdia over the weekend. Then, Monday, she's arraigned, formally charged in secret.
Secretly?
No lawyer, no family allowed.
Wow. I mean, that level of secrecy that's got to be a red flag, right?
Oh, yeah. You got to wonder, if the government thinks they've got good reason to arrest her, why not just do it out in the open?
Transparency. Why hide it if you're doing things by the book?
Exactly. This whole thing just screams we're trying to silence dissent, not we're trying to address the real problems.
In the article, it suggests this isn't an isolated incident.
Right. Sahara Reporters points out that this is becoming a trend across Nigeria. Governors are targeting their opponents, even everyday folks on social media who dare to criticize them.
So basically, you post a video calling out your local officials, and boom, you're arrested. No lawyer, no due process.
That's the scary reality Hamdi is facing. And it fits into a bigger picture, shrinking civic space in Nigeria. We need to talk about the Take It Back movement.
TB. I've heard of them. They're a human rights organization, right?
Right. Well respected. And they've condemned Hamdia's arrest, naturally. They're arguing that it sets a really dangerous precedent for freedom of expression.
Yeah, they're not just defending one woman here. They're defending everyone's right to speak up without fear.
Exactly. To speak truth to power without worrying about being silenced. So let's recap. You've got Hamdia arrested for speaking out against violence, against a backdrop of very real insecurity, and a respected human rights organization raising alarm bells about, a crackdown on dissent. This paints a pretty grim picture of what's happening in Nigeria, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, this isn't just happening in Nigeria. This pattern of silencing dissenting voices is something we're seeing more and more around the world.
It's almost like a global playbook for, how to suppress opposition and control the narrative.
It is. Think about authoritarian regimes that imprison journalists or shut down the internet when there are protests. It's all about preventing people from holding their leaders accountable.
It makes you wonder, if you can be arrested for speaking out against violence, where does that leave citizens who are trying to push for change?
That's the core question we need to grapple with here. Hamdia's case, this should be a wake-up call. What's happening in Nigeria, it matters to all of us. We need to understand that the erosion of free speech anywhere is ultimately a threat to democracy everywhere.
Yeah. Hamdia's story, it might feel far away, but the principles at stake, they're universal.
Freedom of expression is a foundational human right. We can't let it slip away.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We uncovered a pretty alarming situation in Sokoto, but this conversation doesn't end here. Keep thinking about the importance of free speech. We all have a responsibility to defend it, not just in Nigeria, but globally.
It's something we all need to be vigilant about.
Talking about a bandit attack in ZAMFARA State, Nigeria. And we're going beyond the headlines here. We've got this firsthand account from Sahara Reporters, and it really gives you a chilling look at what folks in this region are going through.
Yeah, it's just awful. And what's even more disturbing is how this attack, it just fits into this much larger pattern of violence that's been plaguing this region for almost a decade now.
It's scary to think about. So in this specific attack, we're talking about the village of Wank near Gusau, the capital of ZAMFARA State. Over 100 villagers were kidnapped. And it wasn't just men. Women, children, the elderly, no one was spared. These bandits were absolutely ruthless. They were chasing people down on motorbikes, looting homes, operating like they were completely untouchable.
It's wild. It really shows you the lack of security there and that feeling of lawlessness that's taken hold of the region. You read accounts from survivors, they say things like, the bandits were chasing us like prey. It just sends chills down your spine.
I can't even imagine living with that kind of fear hanging over you every day. The report even mentions the chief imam of the village being kidnapped. And get this was right after he'd been released from a previous kidnapping.
Oh, wow. I mean, the psychological impact of that, to be terrorized like that over and over again, it just creates this constant state of vulnerability and insecurity.
And you can see that reflected in how so many villagers fled to Gusau. They're terrified of more attacks.
Yeah, it's like a mass exodus, driven by pure fear.
And here's where things get even more complicated. This attack has major implications for food security across Nigeria because Zamfara is a crucial agricultural region. It's like the breadbasket of the country.
It is, absolutely. And when you disrupt farming activities like this, it sets off a chain reaction, food shortages, prices go up, everyone feels the impact, not just the people directly affected by the attacks.
It's like a ripple effect that hits everyone's wallet and their dinner plate. But one of the things that really stood out to me in this report was the criticism of the government's response, or rather the lack of response. There's this overwhelming sense of frustration and abandonment coming from the people who are affected.
And when you consider the bigger picture, the political landscape,
Mhm.
you can see how this criticism, it reveals this disconnect between those in power and the people they're supposed to be serving. The source is really questioning the government's reliance on prayer as a solution, when what's needed is real, concrete action.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got officials campaigning for votes, promising security, and then when a crisis hits, they turn to prayer instead of taking charge and doing something.
It really makes you think.
There's this one line that just hits home. The source directly asks the National Security Advisor, "Where are you?"
Wow, that's powerful.
It's a cry for help, a plea for someone to acknowledge their suffering and step up.
It speaks to this feeling of being completely let down. Like those in authority are totally out of touch with what people are going through.
And it gets worse. There were no official statements released about this attack. Sahara reporters even tried to contact the police, but they couldn't get through.
It's deafening, that silence. It just adds to that feeling of abandonment, and it raises serious concerns about accountability.
Exactly. It's like the authorities are turning a blind eye to the suffering of these communities. And the source goes even further. They compare the government's response to these attacks with the response to protests.
And it's a pretty stark contrast, isn't it?
It is. The source points out how quickly the police react to peaceful protests, often with excessive force. Yet when it comes to actual violence and banditry, they seem to be nowhere to be found.
Yeah, it raises questions about priorities. Are they more concerned with suppressing dissent than with protecting their citizens from actual harm?
It makes you wonder.
Mhm.
And then the source ties these attacks to the rising cost of food. It's not just some abstract economic issue. It's a direct consequence of the violence and instability we're talking about.
Right, when farmers are forced off their land, they can't cultivate their crops, the entire supply chain gets disrupted, and that leads to shortages, price hikes. It affects everyone, not just those directly caught in the conflict.
It's a domino effect. And what this whole situation really highlights is how interconnected these issues are. You can't talk about security without talking about food security. And you can't address food security without getting to the root of the violence that's fueling this crisis.
It's a complex web of challenges, and there are no easy answers.
But at the heart of it all is the human cost of this conflict. These aren't just statistics or headlines. These are real people whose lives have been shattered by this violence. The source quotes one survivor who said, "There are no animals left here. When night falls, fear sets in, and it has become too dangerous to stay in these communities overnight."
God, that is just heartbreaking.
And the source makes this powerful statement. They say, God cannot do for us what he has given us the capacity for us to do for ourselves.
It's a call to action.
It is. It's a reminder that thoughts and prayers aren't enough. We need to step up and be part of the solution.
It's about taking ownership and responsibility and recognizing that we have the power to create change.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question. And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of this deep dive.
I can't wait to keep digging into this.
It's easy to focus on the horror of these attacks. But we need to understand the wider impact, especially when you consider ZAMFARA's role as a food producer. And it's not just a general food basket. We're talking about specific crops like sorghum and millet. They're absolutely essential to Nigeria's food supply.
So what happens in Zamfara, it affects people all over the country.
Exactly. When the supply of those staples is disrupted, you see significant price increases, and that impact's going to hit hardest in urban areas, places far from the conflict itself. Think about people in Lagos or Abuja. They rely on those affordable staples, and suddenly they have to stretch their budgets even further.
It's like these invisible consequences, connecting the violence in one region to the well-being of people hundreds of miles away.
And the source highlights that, doesn't it? This isn't just a local security issue, it's about the stability of the whole nation.
You mentioned the psychological impact earlier, the recurring kidnappings, especially the chief imam being taken multiple times. That really stuck with me. Can we learn more from the source material about the trauma on individuals and the community?
Well, there's not a ton of explicit detail, but we can kind of read between the lines. Imagine living under constant threat of being kidnapped, taken from your home, your family. It creates this anxiety and hypervigilance. And for someone like the chief imam, he's supposed to be a source of strength and stability for the community.
Right, so it's like a double violation. He's not only targeted, but it undermines the whole community.
Exactly. And the source doesn't really go into the long-term mental health effects, but there are some. PTSD, family relationships, trust.
It makes you wonder about the support systems. What's there to help these people who've experienced so much trauma?
That's the key question, and unfortunately, the source doesn't give us an answer. But it points to a bigger issue, right? It's not just about physical security. It's about providing emotional and psychological support as well.
So we've talked about the immediate impact, the food security issue, the psychological toll. But the source also criticizes the government's response pretty strongly. It's not just general dissatisfaction. There's a specific critique in there.
Absolutely. Remember that line, God cannot do for us what he has given us the capacity for us to do for ourselves. That's not just a general statement about faith, it's aimed directly at the government.
Okay, so break that down for me. What's the deeper meaning there?
Basically, the source is saying, the government's failing to do its job. They're relying on prayer instead of taking real action. It's a call for leadership, for solutions, not just empty words.
And it's interesting how the source contrasts this with how the government responds to protests.
Right. They point out how quickly and forcefully the government reacts to dissent. But when it comes to protecting citizens from violence, there's this inaction, this apathy.
So it's a double standard. They crack down on those who challenge them, but ignore the real threats to their people's safety.
That's exactly the argument the source is making, and it goes back to that question, where are you?
Yeah.
Directed at the National Security Advisor. It's not just about physical absence. It's about a lack of concern, a failure to prioritize the people's needs.
So what actions is the source calling for? What would a better response look like?
Well, that takes us into policy and strategy,
Yeah.
and the source doesn't really go into specifics.
All right, so let's read between the lines. What can we take away from the critique?
I think they're advocating for a more proactive approach to security, one that doesn't just react to attacks after they happen. It's about investing in law enforcement, intelligence, maybe community programs to address the root causes of the problem.
So moving from reaction to prevention and tackling the underlying socioeconomic factors that drive this violence.
Exactly. Security isn't just about military force. It's about creating a more just society. A society where people aren't pushed to these desperate measures.
That's a powerful idea.
Right.
But I wonder how realistic it is to implement such big changes, given all the political and economic complexities.
Right. And that's where we move from critique to solutions. And that's something we can keep exploring as we continue this deep dive.
I'm ready to keep digging. What else can we uncover from this account? So we've talked about a lot. The attack, the impact on the community, food security, the government's response or lack thereof. It's a pretty grim picture, isn't it? But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier, the psychological impact of these attacks.
You mean the trauma, the lasting fear, the kind that sticks with you even after the danger's gone.
Exactly. We talked about the chief imam being kidnapped multiple times. But what about everyone else? The farmer, too afraid to work his fields. The mothers who can't sleep because they're worried about their children. The source doesn't give us a lot of details, but those scars must run deep.
Oh, absolutely. And it goes beyond individuals. You see the erosion of trust in the community, the breakdown of social structures. When fear takes over, it can paralyze a whole community, make it almost impossible to rebuild and move forward.
So how do you even begin to heal from that? The source talks about taking ownership, finding solutions within ourselves. But where do you even start when everything feels like it's falling apart?
That's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. But the source does offer a little bit of hope. Remember that line, God cannot do for us what he has given us the capacity for us to do for ourselves.
Yeah, it's powerful. But I'm having trouble seeing how that translates into action. It's one thing to say we need to find solutions within ourselves. But what does that actually look like?
Well, think of it this way. The source is rejecting that feeling of helplessness, the idea that we're just victims of fate or whatever. It's about taking back control, realizing we have the power to change things.
So shifting from passivity to empowerment. But how do we actually make that happen? How do we go from feeling powerless to taking action?
That's the challenge. It takes a multi-pronged approach.
Hmm.
You have to address the immediate security issues, but you also have to tackle the underlying problems, the socioeconomic factors that contribute to the violence. It's about building trust between communities and law enforcement, investing in education, economic opportunities, creating a system where those in power are held accountable.
So it's bigger than just catching bandits and punishing them. It's
Yeah.
about fixing the system that allows this to happen in the first place.
Exactly. It requires a change in perspective, both within Nigeria and the international community. We can't just react to crises. We have to invest in long-term solutions, solutions that address the root causes.
This has been an eye-opening deep dive. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. But that message of empowerment, it really sticks with me. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's always hope, always a chance for things to get better. But we have to make it happen. We have to step up, get involved, demand better for ourselves and for everyone else. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this question. What role will you play in creating a more just and peaceful future for Nigeria, for the world? It's a question worth thinking about, more than just a passing thought.
So today, we're going to be tackling a topic that's, pretty heavy, but also incredibly important and complex. We're going to be looking at resource distribution and wealth and the political tensions that are kind of simmering beneath the surface in Nigeria. And our source for this deep dive is, well, it's an audio commentary. It's very raw, very full of emotion, and it was recorded as like a direct response to a breaking news report about a mine collapse.
You know what's really striking about this commentary is the way the speaker uses this tragic event to kind of shine a light on these deeper systemic issues. You can hear the grief in their voice, definitely. But there's also this like burning question, like, is this system, is it actually fair?
Yeah, and the news itself is just devastating. At least 22 illegal gold miners
Okay.
are feared dead after this mine collapsed in Taraba State, which borders Adamawa State. And the speaker's immediate reaction is this plea for rescue efforts, but then almost instantly it's like, this dam breaks open.
Yeah, and that's when things get really fascinating. They start talking about this like fundamental imbalance in how Nigeria manages its resources. And to kind of illustrate their point, they compare oil revenue, which is shared nationally, to the gold resources that are found up north.
And that comparison really lays the groundwork for their main argument.
Right.
They're
Absolutely.
saying that the gold, unlike the oil revenue, only benefits a small group, a powerful group.
Precisely. And this is where the speaker brings up the North-South divide. It's a term you hear a lot in Nigerian politics. They're talking about this long-standing tension over who controls resources and ultimately who holds the economic power.
To be honest, I'm not super familiar with Nigerian politics. Could you maybe unpack this North-South divide a bit more for us?
Well, absolutely. So the speaker is referencing a historical and economic reality in Nigeria. So the South, particularly the Niger Delta region, is incredibly rich in oil. And that's been the country's primary source of revenue for decades.
Mm.
But the speaker, and many others, argue that the distribution of this oil wealth hasn't been fair. They feel that the South, which bears the environmental and social costs of oil extraction, hasn't received its fair share of the profits.
That makes a lot of sense. So they're drawing a parallel between that ongoing tension over oil in the South and what they see happening with gold in the North.
Exactly. And the speaker even points to past statements from groups like the South-South Forum, which represents the interests of the oil-producing states, and Southern governors, who voiced concerns about resource allocation and revenue sharing for years. So this highlights how deep-rooted this debate is. It's not a new grievance.
So it's like this feeling of, hey, if the South is raising these concerns about oil, shouldn't the same logic apply to the gold in the North?
Right. And the speaker takes it a step further by claiming that a lot of the gold mining in the North is illegal. They're not just talking about a difference in how revenue is shared. They're alleging a system that's rigged, to benefit a select few, and leaving many in the North behind.
Which brings us back to that mine collapse, right?
Yes.
Because the speaker is clearly connecting this tragedy
To
to
this
the larger issue of illegal mining.
Yeah, and they define illegal mining in this context as operations that are unregulated, often very dangerous, and just don't adhere to any safety standards. And the speaker claims that this is rampant in the North. And they even allege that the profits are lining the pockets of corrupt politicians and other influential figures.
Wow. That's a serious accusation. Do they give any specific examples?
They do. The speaker mentions a current governor and a former governor, both of whom are allegedly amassing huge personal wealth from gold. Now, we can't verify the accuracy of these specific claims without further investigation, but they highlight this pervasive sense of distrust and the belief that corruption is fueling this dangerous, unregulated mining industry.
It's like they're saying this mine collapse. It wasn't just an accident. It was a symptom of a broken system.
Exactly. And that sentiment is what makes this commentary so powerful. It forces us to look beyond the immediate tragedy and confront these broader questions of power, wealth, and who truly benefits from Nigeria's resources.
So what does the speaker propose as a solution? Because it's clear they believe that a change is needed.
Well, the speaker issues this passionate call for a national dialogue, a conversation that involves everyone on how Nigeria should manage its resources and how to share the revenue generated from them. And they suggest something pretty radical, giving states more control over their resources, potentially to the point where they retain all the revenue, maybe contributing a percentage to the federal government.
Wow. That would completely overturn the existing system. It seems like a pretty controversial idea.
Oh, absolutely. It would be a massive shift with a lot of potential ramifications. But it's clear that the speaker sees this as the only way to achieve true fairness and ensure that the wealth generated from resources actually benefits the people living in those regions where those resources are extracted.
Yeah, I can see how that would appeal to people who feel like their regions have been shortchanged for so long. But it also seems like it could create a whole new set of challenges.
You're absolutely right. There are a lot of complexities to consider. How would this impact national unity? What about regions with fewer resources? Would they be left behind? And could this lead to more conflict over resource ownership and boundaries?
That's a lot to unpack. And I'm guessing this isn't the only perspective on how to address these issues.
You're right. There are other viewpoints and potential solutions out there. So after a quick break, let's dive into those different perspectives, explore the historical context of this debate, and consider the potential consequences of such a dramatic shift in resource management in Nigeria.
Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were talking about the speaker's call for this radical restructuring of resource management in Nigeria, giving more control to individual states. But as we were saying, this is such a complex issue with so many different perspectives.
Absolutely. And to fully understand, the weight of this speaker's argument, we need to dig into the historical context a bit of this whole North-South divide.
Okay, so let's go back in time a bit. When did this tension over resources and regional power, when did it really begin?
Well, you can trace it back to even before Nigeria gained independence in 1960. Different regions were already kind of vying for control, and then the discovery of oil in the South in the late 1950s just added fuel to the fire.
So the seeds of this divide were planted pretty early on, but how has this played out over the decades since independence?
Honestly, it's been a recurring theme. The speaker mentions the South-South Forum and Southern governors raising these concerns about resource allocation. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. These groups have been fighting for greater control over oil revenue for decades.
And what exactly are their arguments? Why do they feel like the current system is unfair?
Well, they argue that the South bears the brunt of the environmental and social costs of oil extraction, oil spills, gas flaring, pollution. These are really serious issues that impact the livelihoods and health of communities in the Niger Delta, and yet they feel like they haven't seen a fair share of the profits generated from that oil.
That makes sense. It's like they're saying, we're the ones living with the consequences, but we're not reaping the rewards.
Exactly. And the current revenue sharing formula, which allocates a larger percentage of oil revenue to the federal government, has been a major point of contention. And the speaker, by comparing this to the way gold is managed in the North, is tapping into that deep-seated frustration.
So it's not just about the speaker's claims of illegal gold mining and corruption in the North. They're drawing a direct line to this long history of grievances in the South over oil revenue.
Precisely. And that's what makes this commentary so potent. It connects a current tragedy to this historical narrative of resource control and the struggle for economic power.
Okay, so we've got this historical context. But what about alternative viewpoints? Are there other solutions to these issues of resource management and regional inequality that don't involve such a radical decentralization?
Absolutely. Some people argue that instead of completely overhauling the system, the focus should be on reforming the existing revenue sharing formula to ensure a more equitable distribution of oil wealth.
So tweaking the system rather than blowing it up.
Exactly. There are also proposals to strengthen regulatory bodies, increase transparency in the mining sector, and invest more in developing alternative sources of revenue beyond oil and gold.
So diversifying the economy to reduce dependence on these finite resources.
Exactly. And then there's the argument for increased investment in things like education, infrastructure, and job creation in regions that have been